Oh, I started out uh, with playing the organ in 1952. I was 12 years old. And my parents had bought me a Hammond organ, one of the B3s, and they were $2,500 in those days. That was a lot of money, and they weren't wealthy people. But they thought I should have that because I'd been playing accordion for a couple of years. And when I started playing that organ, I went crazy. I don't know how they stood it, but I'd play or practice 3, 4 hours a day when I'd come home from school. And shortly after that, I was 14 years old. I got a job playing in a restaurant, and it was really wonderful. I was making quite a bit of money as a 14-year-old kid playing the Hammond organ because um, that was the thing in those days. Practically every restaurant of any account would have a Hammond organist or some kind of musician. And so I knew what I wanted to do because I was making all this money. I went to high school but barely graduated because I only went to school the required number of days, just enough to get through. But then at the same time, in 1956, one of my high school chums turned me on to ham radio, and oh my goodness, it went crazy from there because I had been taking my organ lessons in St. Louis from a celebrity that played at the Fox Theater, and he was on television every day. He took me under his wing, and across the street from where I would take these lessons was Walter Ash Radio. And I'd go over there and spend time. Well, eventually I became a ham. I was 16 years old, and it was it was a wonderful time. I was a technician for 17 years because there the bands were open all the time. I was on 6 meters for all these years. I didn't work any low frequency. I was all interested in the VHF and UHF, and the uh, the entire thing about the radio was I loved to build. I learned that you could build things really easy, and so I started building things. I hadn't been on the air and been a ham for just a few weeks, and I had read an article in the QST magazine about a small transmitter. It was a 2E26 and on 6 meters, and I built it, and it worked. I go, whoa! So I was off and running as far as ham radio and building, and this really has been the basis of my entire life is amateur radio. Again, at that same time, I was summoned to play at the Fox Theater in St. Louis. My teacher, who was the organist there, he needed some help to not only substitute, but he needed help to voice and tune the pipes. That organ had not been played in over 20 years, and there were thousands of pipes, nearly 4,000 of them. And we had to voice and tune these pipes. Now, voicing is the incredible thing where you had to really listen so that all of them would have the same harmonic value or not, depending on how you wanted that set of pipes to sound. There is where I learned to listen. And when that happened, I didn't realize what an incredible thing that was going to be in my life. But it certainly was a pillar because, again, between the building of ham radio projects and being able to listen, most people just hear. Not a lot of people listen. Listening is it's an ability to dissect what you hear, all the different harmonics. If there's some distortion and things, you need to be able to figure that all out. That was the beginning of my careers. and there were two of them together. And I came into a couple of years on the air. I just loved all that VHF. I had a local Motorola dealer, ham friend of mine, and he and another ham friend who was a construction guy, they put up a 110-foot Roan. My parents were so loving. They allowed me to do this. And I just went crazy from there.
Is that at your in your garden at the back of your house?
Yeah, that was on one side of the house.
Wow.
That's a 36-foot long Telerex and J-beams from the UK on 2 meters. And a year later, I wanted to get a better antenna for 2. And there you can see part of the top of the house on the other side. It was a Victorian, a larger home. And I put up, had my friends, my Motorola friend and my contractor friend, 2 hams. They helped put up a 50-foot tower. There I had 2 2-meter Telerexes, 36-foot long, 15 elements. One I mounted horizontal, the other I mounted vertical. What I learned from the reading books is that you could run the leads down in the shack, and by playing with phasing lines, you could get all kinds of patterns going. That's where I really got in to learning about phasing and all kinds of other things, because I've become a nut for that, for phasing. I still am, even to this day. But in
you have extensive experience in ham radio, which is really a dominant theme, which we'll come back to. But just at these early days and moving into the 60s, was there ever a chance that you might end up being a musician, maybe playing in a band like the ones you worked with in the 60s?
No, I never played with anyone. It was always solo with the big theater organs. I never wanted to play with anyone. The theater organ is an orchestra, and you are the leader of that particular instrument. I mean, they end up with around 300 stop controls, and it's an incredible instrument. And so, no, in fact, very few of the artists I worked with for those decades even knew I played the organ, because it was a totally different thing. It wasn't their type of music. It was all like theater organ, musicals and different pop music from orchestras. And that's what we play on the theater organ. But then in 1959, I wanted more power. I had become the 10th person in the country to build a single sideband rig for 6 meters. One of my great mentors that I met on the air a couple of weeks after I got my license, he was the chief engineer at CBS Radio in St. Louis. And he was such a help to me. He was one of the very first single sideband station. You had to build these things. You couldn't go buy a single sideband transmitter. You hardly could do it on the low freaks, but it wasn't there much. Well, he taught me how to build. And I built Central Electronics 10B from a kit. And I had, he guided me from things I needed. I bought that kit. I also bought a Millen grid dip meter and built a 36 megacycle oscillator so we could mix that and 14 megs out of the sideband transmitter. We were on 6 meters. And I didn't realize that I was one of just a few, but I put that into my new Johnson 6 and 2 Thunderbolt. That gave me 1.5 kilowatts on 6 and 2 meters. And it was just incredible with the big antennas and the power in single sideband. I was really making some big moves in
that is quite impressive, not least the huge antennas, which would have made your house stand out and easy to find you when you had visitors. I just ask if in addition to your particular interest, the timing. This is the late 50s, or around about 1957. There was the solar maxima. Now, I'm just wondering to what extent that you're operating at 6 meters, which helps you cover very long distances, and particularly during a solar maximum, you can cover even longer distances. To what extent do you think that had a role? Why it was popular radio and your interest in it around about the time in the late 50s?
I had no idea that it was anything different. I was kind of silly those first few years, figuring, boy, this is going to be great. I'm just going to be able to work the world on 6 meters forever. No, it was the largest sunspot cycle. I got in right at the beginning of it. The peak was somewhere around 1960. That was when I had just built that 6 and 2 Thunderbolt. So you can imagine what kind of signal was coming out of this 110-foot Roan with these 36-foot long antennas and the power and single sideband. It was quite something. And I was really enjoying all of the things that I did and learned. And I was on the air a lot because by then, at 1959, I got a job. I was out of high school. That was it. High school was in my way. I got a job at a restaurant in St. Louis. It was a 4-star restaurant. It was a German restaurant. And I built a pipe organ and put it in that restaurant. And people would come from all over the country to hear it, because it was very unique to be able to have a great 4-star restaurant and see this pipe organ. I put all of the pipes were behind glass, and I had a large console, and the console was it came from the Covent Garden Theater in Chicago, and I used that and rebuilt all of it. But anyway, this was quite something. I played 6 nights a week. Well, the deal there was I would get home about midnight. The bands were open all the time. When I tell people this, they think I'm making it up. No, they were just constantly open on the VHF frequencies, not like today. And so I would have a lot of time. I'd get up I usually wouldn't go to bed till 3 o'clock in the morning, and get up about 10 or 11 and get the building and on the air, whatever I wanted to do with my ham radio. And then about 6 o'clock, I had to get in my car and head to the restaurant. So I got a lot of time on the radio. I'm just amazed when I look through all the logs of thousands of people I talked to. Well, in 1959, I got a call one day from Bob Drake. Bob Drake was the owner and founder of the Drake Radio Company. I'm sure you've heard of that. And he said, we have this ham meeting. It was a technical meeting. We do it once a year, and we look for technical papers. And we understand that you're one of just a few on single sideband on 6 meters, and we would like for you to come here and tell us about it. Well, I had a friend of mine who had a Bonanza airplane, and we flew out to the Biltmore Hotel in Dayton, Ohio, 1959. That was the beginning of the Dayton Hamvention. It was held in a large hotel downtown Dayton. They had taken all the furniture out of one of the floors. And in those rooms were the Collins room, the Hallicrafter room, the Drake room, the Central Electronics, all of these different manufacturers. However, they were there. They were like celebrities to me. I'd read about them in the magazines, but I got to meet and speak and really spend time with Bob Drake, with Wes Shum, the man that brought single sideband to ham radio. No, it wasn't Art Collins. He was 6 years late to the party. It was Wes Shum in 1948. And I just went through all these people's and Carl Mosley from the Mosley plant. Then I walked in this room and it was the J-Beam company. Well, I already had the J-Beam 16 elements. They said, we're looking for somebody like you. Would you like to perform an experiment with one of our large antennas? And yeah, why not? And I had a spare lot beside our home. My parents, I should say, they were just absolutely angels. They allowed me to do about anything, but I was able to pay for all of this. This wasn't costing them anything because I had quite a career going at the age of 14. Well, they allowed me to do this. And so for the J-Beam company, they shipped over their antenna. Their antenna was a 128 element 2-meter array. And it was just unbelievable. The Motorola dealer and the construction contractor, K9SGD and K9EBA, they again, in this spare lot beside our home, we put up a 40-foot Roan, and it was we used another 40-foot for the boom, and installed all of these antennas. And they all had to have phasing harnesses. They had to be wired correctly. The Motorola dealer knew about all this because he did phasing harnesses and stuff in his Motorola dealership. So I learned a tremendous amount about how the things were in phase and out of phase. Used two B29 prop pitch motors to turn them and to rotate them to the moon. Now, I didn't know at the time much about moon bounce. Yes, I'd heard about it, and you know, it was going to happen, but I didn't understand exactly how I was going to figure into the moon bounce stuff. And I had the thing aimed up to the sky one day, and I heard this very weak signal. And I thought, whoa. And it was W5KHT. Well, I quickly grabbed my license book, or you could tell where people were, and it was Bob Cooper. Well, I got his address from that. I couldn't get his telephone number, but I got his address. And what went on there was we started talking about this wonderful antenna I had. And Bob Cooper was a very interesting guy. He was the father of home satellite television, but he was doing moon bounce from his backyard. He had bought several old surplus dishes, and he was building LNAs, low noise amplifiers, in coffee cans, and actually building TVRO systems. But he, excuse me, he was using one of them for his ham radio, and he and I did some moon bounce shots with the great 128 element. Well, I can't tell you the feelings when all this was going on. It's like, wow, what are we doing? But Bob and I became pretty close friends. We're going to come back to him because that was 1962 through 63, 4, right in there. But we're going to come back to Bob.
Let me just take you back to 1957, Bob. When that's the year of Sputnik. That's the first time there was a radio transmitter in space. Did you ever listen into that?
I did not. I did not. I really didn't have much interest in all of that until when I was playing in the restaurant, starting in 1959. It would have been about right before I met up with Bob Cooper. I had a very interesting thing happened. The restaurant was called Schneidhorst. It was a German restaurant, as I told you.
Right.
It was right across the street from McDonnell Douglas, where they built the first capsule, and in 1959. And about every 2 months, the 7 original astronauts would come, stay in the hotel. That was the restaurant was in a large hotel, and they would spend a night having a nice dinner and listening to my organ music.
Right.
And about the second time they came, as I said, they came every couple of months. Alan Shepard came up, and I'm on this large theater organ, and it had a pretty large bench, and he rolled up, sat next beside me, and I'm going, whoa, this is Alan Shepard. And he said, hey, he says, I know about all these things. My father had a pipe organ in our home.
Oh.
And he'd wake me up every morning playing that thing. It was pretty loud.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew all about the pipe organ, and we'd spend our time talking about the pipe organ and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And on one of the occasions, he took me back to the table, and there's a copy of most of the 7 original astronauts signed the menu for me: Walter Schirra, Shorty Powers, Deke Slayton, and so on. And these were to me really incredible people, but they were so friendly to me, all very anxious to know how I learned to build that.
Right.
And I told them that I learned a lot through ham radio. And Alan asked me, he said, what kind of antennas are you using? I said, well, we have a couple, but one of them, my fave, is the 128 element, because I can point it to the moon and bounce signals off the moon. And he said, that you can do that. And I said, yes. He said, can we borrow that? And I thought he was kidding. I said, what do you mean? You need to ship this to Houston? No. Do you have a phone patch? And I said, I really do. I do have a phone patch. He said, well, what we'd like to do. Now, you understand, this is way before they were really getting into some of the space shots. He said, you know, we know from our calculating that how long it takes the signal and what the delay time is. But we've never been able to test it. The only time we're going to test it is when we're up there. He said, if you could take a phone call from us and patch it into your transmitter and point your array at this precise point that we tell you, we could listen for your signal on the phone and count how long it takes to get back to us. And that's exactly what they did. And so now this little kid became a piece of history, I guess. And the only sad part, I never verified it. I should have recorded it. I didn't do that. I didn't want to tread upon, to me, this was kind of secret, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want to go blasting this to the world. I didn't tell very many people this. I didn't get on the ham radio and say, guess what I did last night? No, it was nobody's business. This was, to me, very special. And
did they ever ask you not to communicate that publicly?
Well, they said they didn't really come out real strong, but he said, we really should kind of keep this together. And from that, I meant, keeping it together.
And this is the early 1960s, so it's quite sensitive. So can I just ask, just to confirm that I understand what this experiment was? So you had your 128 element antenna at, next to your house.
Yep.
You've got a phone call from, I guess, Houston. They're calling you to your house, and you piping that telephone call through your antenna to the moon.
Yep.
And then NASA is picking up the reflection. Is that what we're talking about?
That's exactly right. In fact, I still have the phone patch, if you'd like to see it.
Oh, if it's nearby, yeah.
Well,
and
stand by. Stand
right.
by. I'll be right back.
Okay.
You don't use it today, but I can't throw it away. This is a huge part of my life.
Yeah.
It was made by the Gonset company.
Right.
And it was quite something in those days. Every ham had a phone patch just about. And what you would do, you would take the two phone wires, connect them here. Right. You would take the speaker, receiver speaker to the other connectors. You plug your microphone into here, and you could set the levels and so on. And so then when you would receive a phone call, you had a level control for that. But then you had a transmitter control, and you had to watch the meter. And when the phone line would come up and you adjust that, it would be tied into your transmitter because you had that plugged in here. So the telephone become the microphone for your transmitter. In this case, the microphone was in Houston, Texas.
Now, I assumed that you were talking about an acoustic coupler, but that is actually just an electronic connection.
Oh yeah, directly. Acoustic is no good. They don't sound very good.
Can I just ask you, whilst you've got it in your hand, that looks remarkably new. How old would that be?
Well, I bought it in 1959. Look at that picture real close. And my nose is right in front of my nose this very piece. Can you make that out?
Yeah.
Yeah, right in front of my nose is this very piece. I'll be darned.
And does he have a name? Is it particularly?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. The Gonset company made it. Gonset. They were a big deal, and it was a hybrid phone patch, GPP1. Gonset phone patch.
That's incredible. It just looks so new.
Well, all of my equipment does. I never drug it behind my car. I don't know how. I see people's gear once in a while on eBay or wherever. Look like they drug it behind their car with a chain. Like, how do they get things so dirty and messed up?
So, just going back to this story, then you've done this experiment on behalf of NASA. Did you ever understand why they asked you to do this?
Yeah, it was all about the delay time. They had figured it out about with equations about the distance, but they just wanted to make sure.
Right.
And this was an opportune time for them to do that.
And do you remember the date when you did that experiment?
I don't. I'd have to look back. It would have been in 61 or 2.
Right. Now, bearing in mind that it is 1961 or 2, NASA would have had these huge dishes. They could quite easily, I would have thought, been able to do that kind of experiment directly without involving you.
Yes. And that's something I never did understand, but I thought maybe they were doing something else or trying to look at it from another location.
Right. And once you completed that experiment with NASA, did you have further exchanges with either some of the astronauts or indeed with other?
No, I did not. No, they once they got really rocking and rolling, they never came to the restaurant or to the hotel. They never came back to McDonnell Douglas. That's the whole deal.
That's a fascinating story. And did you ever get interested in listening to transmissions, audio transmissions from crewed spacecraft during the 1960s, the Mercury, Gemini,
Oh yeah.
and Apollo
Yeah.
series.
Yeah, when Owen Garrett went up, he was the first ham that went up. I worked a deal with this school, a local school. We had the whole school out. We set up antennas in the parking lot and all that, and we worked Owen. It was a fascinating time for those children, and as it was for me too. And
Yeah.
I got the QSL card somewhere around here from
Right.
that. It's all, you know, this is all history, but it played such a huge part in my life. And a lot of people say, "Well, you didn't go to college. You didn't." I didn't know this. This was my college. Ham radio was my college,
And
and
I think despite the fact that NASA could have done it without you, the fact that you were involved, I think is such an exciting activity and a fascinating story. Let me take you back to, you mentioned Bell Labs. Now, Bell Labs was a phenomenal enterprise. I only came across their work because of people like Carl Jansky, who essentially introduced radio astronomy back in the 1930s, and the work that two Bell Lab employees, Pansius and Wilson, I think they were, who discovered the cosmic background radiation and eventually got Nobel Prizes for them. What was your interaction with Bell Labs, and what role did they play in your career?
well, that was after I got a call from Paul Klipsch. Paul Klipsch was the father of the folded horn. He was really one of the leaders in the hi-fi movement. And he had called me one day because there was at that time was a lot of things written about my large PA systems and all of that. Uh, and I should say a couple of things about the TVRO industry before we leave this, if you'd like for me to do that.
Oh, yes, please.
Bob Cooper, again, back as I told you, we did the moon bounce stuff together, but I hadn't heard from him in many years. And in it would have been 77 or so, I saw him on a national television, and he had a little 6-foot dish, and he was talking about being able to pick up television via satellite. And that, wait a minute, that's Cooper. Well, I did have his phone number then, so I called him, and it went nuts because at that time, I'd been on KMOX radio in St. Louis. This was a powerhouse in the center of the country, 50 kW clear channel. We covered 44 states at night, and I had a little show called High Tech Heil. And we'd talk about new things. Well, we were starting to talk about satellite television and woke up the country because is this really going to happen? I also was on a local television show, ABC, doing the same thing. Well, Bob Cooper was holding classes in his backyard to teach who wanted to come. Most of them, they only had like 10 or 12, were hams or TV dealers. And he showed us how to build an LNA, low noise amplifier, in a Folgers coffee can. We could get surplus dishes from the government, and you could point it to the sky if you knew where to point it and get that 22,000 mile signal. Bingo, because HBO was up there at the time. And that's a whole interesting story about that. And he started watching them in Oklahoma. He called in New York one day and he said, I need to probably tell you people I'm picking your signal up really good here in Oklahoma. And I said, well, that's not possible. Well, it is possible here. And he held the phone up and, how's he doing this? And they never realized that it was going to be a big deal. To them, they were only using satellite to go between cable companies. And they didn't realize it was going to be a thing for all Americans or all Englishmen, anybody in the world. You could pick these things up. Well, he he was just a remarkable guy, and he taught us all how to do that. Well, I really got involved in satellite television. I put up thousands of dishes because in the state of Illinois, back in the southern half of Illinois, there were no large cities. St. Louis was it, Paducah, Kentucky, or Terre Haute, Indiana. Well, those are all hundreds of miles away. So there were a lot of people in 1975, 8, 9. They had no television. And I say that to people that are here for, no, think about it. The only way they got it would be to put up like 150-foot tower to receive from the major stations.
Mhm.
And they would hire me to go to the Consumer Electronics Show, NAB, National Association of Broadcasters. They would hire me to attend those and teach people how to find the satellite and build these satellite systems. And I had got a contact at one of those shows, the Hubbard family, Stanley Hubbard. He was a grandson of the patriarch. They're really broadcast industry giants. But he said, I need you to come to Minneapolis. He said, we are working on something and I'd like for you to be a part of it. So after that show, we went up to Minneapolis. That's where the Hubbard hub is. He had just spent $60 million and bought a license. Now, this is 1985 when he bought the license for the first K-band satellite signal. And because he was the first one to put the money up, he could pick where in the arc he wanted to be. Guess where it's going to be? Dead south, so he could cover both coasts of America. And he had this idea that he could have much smaller dishes. It's 4 times higher in frequency. The dish is not going to be 10 foot or 8 foot. It's going to be 2 foot. And he had me become one of his test stations. He had about 10 of us around the country. In 1991, that was 4 years before DirecTv started. It was on the air. We were doing test shots. They would send signals to me and I would tell them on the phone what the signals were. Well, in 1994, again, I went on ABC television in America to tell them it's here. We were at the Consumer Electronics show floor in 1994, and that started the big run. For me, the vice president of DirecTV came to my place, and we installed the very first DirecTV system in a home in St. Louis. Paul came to Marissa, Illinois, my hometown. He was to me he was a saint because he'd done all these things. I'd never met him, but I'd read some of his stuff. And he took me that night in his plane. He flew his little Bonanza up to Marissa, flew back to Hope, Arkansas, to where his lab was. His lab was an old telephone exchange that had been closed, and that was his new lab. And there's a picture of his K-horn, as he called it, the corner horn out in plexiglass. It was incredible because I was there a couple of days, but just in a couple of days, he can't teach me a lot of stuff, but he guided me. And one of the things he guided me to was what they call the idea factory of the 1920s. Bell Labs was a consolidation of AT&T and Western Electric. And Western was the manufacturing arm of the Bell system. They had put 4,000 scientists and engineers that were assigned to this newly created Bell Telephone Lab. They were fully dedicated to researching how the human ear worked and what audio frequencies were most important to understand the spoken word. And it was difficult for me. I had to go to the library. He gave me just lists and notes, do this, find this, do this. But we didn't have Google. I had to go to the library, and I wasn't much of a student, as you learned earlier, but I really dug into that and got an audio encyclopedia, which is an amazing book. I've never seen one. I don't have it in this room, but it's about 6 or 7 inches thick, thousands of pages, all about these studies and lots of other studies. But why did they have to put these 4,000 scientists in? What was that about, huh? Well, it was pretty simple. When they started the telephone company, they ran 2 wires from New Jersey to the West Coast. Well, every 50 miles, they put a relay station up so that the frequency would come up, the level would come up, the voltage was, everything was very, very linear. No problem. But what happened? When they turned the telephone system on, they didn't hear this flat response. And I can easily demonstrate what happened. When they first turned it on, this is what they heard. Whoa, there was no articulation. It's like, what happened to all of it? It was all mushy and bassy. There was no articulation. What happened? The essence of sound was simply struck away. The F and the S, the P and the B. Well, what were we going to do? And so what they did was they called upon their 2 experts of the 4,000. There were 2 guys that were the leads, and these 2 guys were Dr. Harvey Fletcher and Dr. Weldin Munson. And I would hope that most people knew about Fletcher-Munson. They started a study of the human ear, and it was quite remarkable what they discovered. Our ears are not flat. And up at about 100, 110 dB, they're almost flat at that level when it's really loud. That's why kids like to listen to their music real loud. They get to hear the bass. They get to hear the vocal mid-range. They get to hear the cymbals. But down at 10 or 20 dB where we're listening right now, looks like a ride at Disneyland. So the scientist and Fletcher-Munson, they figured it out. There was one particular thing that had to happen. First of all, the telephone company is from 300 to 3,500. But if it was flat, that didn't make it, as we just heard. They discovered that 2.5K is the magic. And I'll demonstrate that very easily. I'm going to take everything flat. This is the way it's flat. And it has no life. The F and the S, the whole essence of sound is not, it's not very good. So what I'm going to do, I'm not doing anything except one control. When I bring up 2.5K, listen. Remember what I said about listening earlier? You got to dissect. You really got to dig into what you hear. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. And when we get up to here, now we have some real essence of sound. It's simply stunning how much we can understand with 2.5 in a rise of about 5 to 6 dB. I'll take it back again. And now the essence of sound is gone. It's simply not there. I'll bring it back. When I bring it back, you know exactly when I did that. And so from there, oh my, everything in my whole thought process, it was changed because we discovered that it was all about speech articulation. But how are you going to correct that? They had no equalizers. They had none. They just did what they did, and that was it. They had no what we call today equalizers. The term equalizer was born, and they did it by this. They had to do it passively. They came in with the signal that was all flat, muffled, and they put a capacitor in series to the output. But at that same time, at the output, they got a resistor to ground. The value of the capacitor and the resistor gave us a high pass filter and rolled off some of the lows. And so we could build some type of a structure that would give us better speech articulation, because those 4,000 scientists discovered we have to have 2.5K rise. They also built a low pass filter, which was the reverse. The signal would come in flat, go through a resistor on the way to the output. But at that output and resistor junction, they had a cap to ground, which would take all the highs to ground. And depending on the size of the capacitor and resistor, they could make it happen. Well, in 1920s late, there was this young man. His name was John Volkmann. He was working at RCA. In the late 20s, the cinema houses were beginning to have talkies. And so now they needed some way to get that equalization to the motion picture playback systems up. How did he do it? Well, from studying what the Bell Lab guys found out, he was using passive RC filters for different values, and he built a very crude switching network, built a few low pass filters, all different frequencies, and a few high pass. And by switching these in and out, he could select which ones he wanted. Now, they weren't like we have today. He was just after that particular one filter. And that's what happened when equalization was kind of born. The surprising thing to me, now we're talking early 30s, nothing happened up until 1967. Yes, we had some minor equalization in the hi-fi deals, the late 40s through the 50s, but they were just bass and treble controls. They would put that resistor on a variable. It did a couple of dB, but nothing really significant, but it was still really good. And that's what we lived with. He thought, this is great. We could turn up the bass a little bit, and we could turn down the treble or whatever, but it wasn't really big. 1967 until Langevin came along. They were builders of studio control consoles and stuff. Langevin built the very first production equalizer. Had a little knob at the top that you could select the frequencies, 15K, 3K, 5K, whatever. And then the resistor was on a slide control. Oh, this was a miracle. But later on, the next year, they came up with a Langevin 252. The 252 Langevin was a GRAHIC equalizer. I mean to tell you, this was a stunning thing that happened in the audio world. I had been wanting back in around 67, I started looking to build a console. And I went to Langevin and I bought a pair of they were portable mixers, 8 channels each, which gave me 16 channels. You can't realize there's no way. Up until that time, we were just using little 4-channel mixers with no EQ. That's what we had. I did Jimi Hendrix with a little 4-channel mixer, my first big show. Janis Joplin, same deal. Well, these mixers came out. I had a cabinet builder build me this really cool console, and we mounted these 2 Langevin AM4s. But up in the top above it, we had a compressor limiter that they built. But over in the extreme right corner, I had one of their new 252s. You can imagine when Heil Sounds would roll up into a show with this really cool mixer with equalization. Oh my. But we really started doing some huge things in those days with all of the rock things. But we did it because of the technology that I had learned from Paul Klipsch and the Bell Lab guys. I studied that. I still go back and read some of it. Then they came up with the parametric equalizer, SYMETRIX, and every radio station in the world has a SYMETRIX 528E, including me. It's over there in my console for some of the AM transmitters, because there we not only could change the frequency, we could change the bandwidth of that audio filter. How about that? But it was just interesting and stunning times for me. I'd been
Well,
off air all those years, and I was dedicated to that thing.
It's a fascinating insight, the story you tell about the phone connection from one coast to the other, and finding through that Bell Labs research from Fletcher-Munson the sweet spot of the 2.5K.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that kind of knowledge is incorporated in modern radios through some of the work that you've done for amateur radios today.
Well, I'd been off the air for 12 years. I was out with all the groups doing home theater, all the satellite work. I came back to ham radio. I wrote an article in 1982. It was published by the ARRL and QST, July 1982. After they received the article, they called me back and said, "This is a revelation. This has never been done before. We don't have equalization." It was the lead article, got the cover award for that July 1982. And I'd built this, or written this article as a do-it-yourself. Had all this nice schematics, the layouts, all the parts, and you could build it. I did. I had one mistake. I put my phone number in the bottom, and I started getting phone calls like crazy. Guys didn't want to build it. They wanted to buy it. They want it now, right now. So my plant had been closed for 2 years. We had closed all of the manufacture. We had 35 people working in that 7,000 square foot plant building speakers and mixers and amplifiers and talk boxes and all that. So I hired 2 of my good solder gals back, and we started building equalizers. And it was really something. It took off like crazy. But in 1999, I got a letter from Dr. Inouye, ICOM Inouye Communications. Mm-hmm. He had a picture of his station, and it had one of my equalizers and one of my Gold Line dynamic mic. Whoa. I'm thinking of new radio line, and I just want to check because I want to use your EQ 200 circuit. So anything from the Pro 1, Pro 2, Pro 3, all the way through the ICOM line to the new little 705, the 7300 to 7610, they all have the 2-band EQ 200. And that's really all you kind of need. And Yaesu came to me a year later. Dr. Hasagawa came to me, came into my booth at Dayton. I want to do it better. Oh, what are we talking about? I want to do that EQ thing better. So, well, we could do a parametric. That'd be good. Not so fast. What'd be the problem? So the problem is education. What do you mean? Well, with this simple little EQ 200 and in the ICOM, I did the selection of the frequencies after hundreds and hundreds of playing on the air and a year of just researching it. That's where they should be. With a parametric, you don't have 2 controls, you have 9. And so we have to I do it. Well, they didn't. The first Yaesu was the great 9000. What an incredible transceiver that was. It has really got my way on that one, because I've always said these transmitters needed to have balanced line inputs. So much RFIs because we're using unbalanced. That's stupid, because half of the signal's on the shield. Well, no. So the XLR is your broadcast connector. It's balanced line, ground, plus and minus. That's in the front panel of the 9000. I got my way. They did it. They also did one other thing I wanted. How do you set your mic gain? Oh, you just get on the air and ask Joe if it heard me better here. No, you are the engineer. You should never transmit a signal unless you know exactly what it's going to sound like before you hit the transmit button. And how you do that? You watch the ALC meter. So in the 9000, there is no ALC meter. It says mic gain. They all should say mic gain. But anyway, that went away. They finally got back to just ALC and the stupid Foster 8-pin nonsense. But they're still using my input. It's still balanced line in if you know how to wire it. So all of our microphones, all of our cables for Yaesu are wired so it's balanced line. I don't understand why the manufacturers don't continue that, but anyway.
And it's really interesting that it's called an equalizer, because when it's working at its best, it's actually unequal in terms of the spectrum over which it's operating. That's a fascinating story that you brought us bang up to date with modern ICOM radios, Bob.
And Yaesu and Kenwood and Elecraft, they all followed suit.
Given your, going back to the 1960s, given your experience of supporting live performances on stage and your wireless knowledge through amateur radio, when and were you involved in the introduction of wireless microphones for performance on live stage?
I was not. The situation is that there were a couple of companies that had really researched, and it was really tough for them to get the proper license. And I didn't want to go through all of that. I do a thing that you might want me to do or not. I always end all my meetings, I let you turn it off, because I walk over here, I turn up the big theater organ, and I'll play a couple minutes for you.
That was lovely, Bob. Thank you very much, and good evening.
Okay, thank you. Hope that worked okay.